I suppose. So I am Chris Descent from Creative Concern, and we're working with Libraries Connected to run this webinar all about marketing the library. So really excited to see you all. So thank you ever so much for joining us. It's great to see so many people. And the idea here is to give you a bit of a practical session, really, with plenty of time for discussion. And yeah, as I say, there'll be time for questions throughout. So hopefully we can get to those. So I'm going to screen share now and start the presentation. It's going to be myself and my colleague Faith who will be joining us shortly. So between us, there'll be two people delivering this session for you this morning. Let's give it a go. So. Okay, is that all right? Can people see that? Someone give me a thumbs up so I know that we're all right on that one.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so this session is all about campaign planning. And just very quickly on just one slide, really, or two slides about us at Creative Concern. We're a creative agency. We've been working for nearly 20 years now, supporting cultural organisations, health organisations, and good causes, really, lots of charities, to use communications to make the world a better place. We will have lots of different services under our belt, and hopefully our experience across these services will help in terms of having experience within your world, really. So it's a whole range of different things: copywriting, campaigns and advertising, digital, film design, and so on. And often the campaign includes more than one service, so this is why this is really important. So in terms of what we are covering today, it's about campaign planning, and we're going to go through these different elements, really. So it's why plan at all, the importance of building better briefs, look, realism and keeping the competition in mind. We've got a section on audience targeting. We're going to cover getting the message right. Then we're going to move on to campaign channels and tactics, and a little bit on measuring success. I'll say a little bit on measuring success because actually there's a whole separate, this is one of three marketing webinars. We've got one on campaign, the next one on campaign concepts, which we're looking kind of creativity and coming up with a core concept for a campaign. And then we've also got one specifically on measuring campaign performance. So there's a whole separate webinar on that topic, so hence why we're not going into too much detail on it today. But first off, just a little bit of a warm-up exercise and something just to double check that you know how to use the chat function. So work with Libraries Connected, they're running a campaign where we're looking at compiling a list of novels that have helped you find escape, solace and comfort during the pandemic, or a book that has given you hope for the future. And we're compiling that list. It may well be used as part of a campaign that we're running. It wouldn't be attributed to an individual, so don't worry, it's not going to be a case of Sarah's favourite novel was or so on, but we're going to be compiling the list because we figure that you're people who know books and probably love books and have certainly been doing some reading. So what would be fantastic if in the chat you could put the name of the novel, the author and which library service you are from. And don't overthink it, it's just something that for you personally has been a good read during the pandemic. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that if that's okay, and it'll be a good chance to check out the chat function, and then we will carry on with the rest of the presentation. I'm just going to stop sharing so I can see the chat. So just have a look at the question there, and then I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Some great stuff going in the chat. Thank you very much. This is going to sort out the reading for the rest of my year, so I'm happy. For those who've maybe just joined and don't know what's going on at this moment, we are just putting in the chat a particular novel that has helped in terms of the pandemic, getting you through, making you feel more positive, giving you a bit of solace. And we're just after the name of the novel and the author. Just a bit of a warm up, and also just making sure that everyone can notice where the chat function is on Zoom. So If you're just thinking, what on earth's going on, that's what's going on, just for 1 minute before we carry on with the rest of the presentation. Just 1 more minute, and then we'll carry on. Okay, hopefully I'm back screen sharing again. If someone just give me a thumbs up, that'll be good. All okay? Super. All right, thanks very much. If you're still using the chat, no problem at all. Okay, so let's move on. So let's start with the basics in terms of, let's move the chat, in terms of why plan, which is obviously the sort of starting point. In terms of a plan, why do a plan? So planning makes campaigns more effective, successful and impactful. That's the main thing, really. It also makes the best use of your time and energy. So that's critical as well. And many marketing campaigns fail due to a lack of planning. It's honestly incredible, the number of projects that we kind of get involved in where people ask us to explain why something failed. And it's really the plan wasn't there. So of course it was going to fail in a way. You got very lucky if it had worked. And planning allows you to learn from success and learn from failure. You know, not everything's going to go according to plan, but if you have a plan in place, at least you can learn from that. And that's a really important thing. So what is a good plan made up of? And there's a lot of different building blocks, and those building blocks, this is the kind of structure for the presentation that we're going to go through really today. So a good campaign starts with a really clear brief. We look at competitors, we look at the market offer, we look at your campaign objectives and audience, then we look at messaging, then it's all about in channels, and you might need an incentive to encourage people to take action, and then it's time to launch your plan. So lots of different steps. And we're also I should have mentioned at the beginning, we're also going to make this webinar or an edited version of it available on the internet, on the YouTube channel for Libraries Connected. So if there's anything here you see, oh, I could do with that, or a bit of a kind of aid memoir for the future, then you will be able to get hold of that after this session. So moving on to building a better brief. And what I mean a brief really is, it could be a brief for yourselves. You know, it might be that you are the person solely responsible for marketing activity, and therefore you're actually writing a brief for you. It's still really important to write that brief. It might be it's for the wider team, and it might be that you're actually briefing in an agency. Either way, or one of those options, a good brief is important. And a good brief equals a good campaign. If a poor and vague brief equals a poor or vague campaign. I mean, it's honestly as simple as that, and that's kind of why this matters. And in terms of putting together a good brief, it's all about questions. It's about asking yourself or your team or your manager, or however the structure is, a series of questions. And we're going to go through some of those questions now in terms of kind of the key questions that can make a big difference. So, and some of this is going to sound like so obvious, but again, often the obvious is the best place to start. So you're running a campaign. A campaign for us can be anything. It can be a marketing activity, but often it's about changing people's behaviour. You want more people to do something or acquire a particular service, or you want more people to take part in something or to join your organisation. So you need to start with a question: why are we doing this? And make sure everyone agrees with that. And the next question is, what difference will it make to us? Just to double check that actually you're doing this for the right reasons. Why now is a really good question as well. Are you doing it for a particular reason because you need something to happen in a short period of time, or before the end of the year, or because you've changed your strategy or organisational plan? Ask yourself why now. How will we know if it works? And we're going to get much more into kind of measuring success, but that broad question is good. You know, what is the really key measure that you're going to use to know that your campaign has succeeded? And then get specific. What specifically are we promoting here? I think the days of promoting broad ranges of services to a broad audience are gone, really. So the more specific you can be, both about the service or offer that you're promoting and about the audience, and we'll talk audience later, the better, really. And in terms of why us, why is it coming from you? What's your stake in this? It's really a series of key questions, but it makes a massive difference. And then they're the big questions, but then there's also some more practical questions. So questions around brand. So is this coming from you? Is it your organizational brand? Is it slightly wider than that? And the brand's important because it's about your voice, if you like, the voice of the brand, but also there might be some kind of constraints or opportunities in terms of branding. So thinking about branding, you're going to need a budget. Now, that budget can be small, medium or large, you know, but you need to give yourself something. It's going to cost something. So give yourself a budget, even if that's around your own time as well. That's still part of the budget. So if it's going to take 10 days of your time plus X pounds, that's really part of the budget. What actions are required? What are you asking people to do as a result of this campaign? Give it a time frame as well. Make sure it's not just forever. You know, you need to kind of like sort of say, right, we want to achieve this within the next 6 months, the next year. Give yourself some time frame. The approval process, super important. I've seen so many great campaigns that get blocked at the last minute because somebody's forgotten to ask the right person and they don't like the idea. So make sure you get that is part of the briefing process, is make sure you understand. If it's just you making decisions, great. If it's you and your colleagues, great. But if it has to go higher up the food chain, get all that written down. And are you doing it in-house, or are you doing it through a creative agency, or is it a bit of a combination? It's all that practical stuff that forms the brief. Get that written down, you know, just get it in it can be, you know, a few sides of A4, whatever, but make sure that is in a document, and make sure the important people agree with it. Sounds super basic, but loads and loads of people don't do this. So that's always a key starting point. But once you've done that, you might have quite a long brief and you're thinking, crikey, there's a lot in here. There's lots of different ideas and thoughts and objectives and so on. And that's all fine. But what we try to do then with the briefs that we get sent, and when we're supporting our clients, is say, okay, look, now let's narrow that down. Let's reduce it down to the core of what's really important here. Because particularly when you're going to move into a more creative phase, which we'll cover in the next webinar, it's really important to keep it short, keep it concise. So we often say, right, let's take that. It might be 4 or 5 sides of A4. Let's get it down to 5 lines. Brilliant. Okay, if we had to do that in 1 line, what's right at the core of this? You know, let's get it down to a single line. And if you can go even shorter than that, 3 to 5 words. Sounds daft, but actually it makes a massive difference in terms of keeping it really, really focused. Because often what happens in campaigns, they start simple and then they get more and more complicated as things kind of unravel and more things are added into it. So the process of writing up the big brief and then going really short on it really does make a difference, keeps people focused. And just some examples of that, you know, sometimes those lines are reduced right down and kind of form part of the campaign messaging, or sometimes they're part of an organisation's vision statement. So make poverty history, we've all heard of that one. You know, that's super short, super ambitious, but you know exactly what it's about in 3 words. Here's an organisation mission statement. Our mission is to organise the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I'm sure I probably don't need to tell you whose that is, but that's what Google have as their kind of mission, their reason to exist. And it kind of works in 1 line. You kind of get it, really. Whatever you think of Google, it kind of works in terms of a line. So we've worked on things like foster care recruitment campaigns. So you know, we recruit foster carers in London who are not 30 to 40 years old, 30 to 40 years old. That might be at the core of quite a complicated brief. That is really what we need to do. Or increase membership of a library by 10% in 12 months. So basically just kind of reducing it down, keeping it as tight as possible is really important part of the process. Okay, don't worry, we time for questions shortly, but the next bit is about weighing up the competition, and whatever service or product that you are in charge of promoting or marketing, there's always some competition. You know, it's very, very rare. In fact, I can't think of any single example where there is no competitors. So, and it's important to think about competitors. And why is it important to think about competitors? Because your audience will be. So when they're thinking about, shall I go to the library? Shall I use this service? Shall I, you know, change my behavior? They'll be thinking about that in terms of, well, what else could I be doing with my time, or what else delivers that kind of experience or service? And so weighing up the competition is super important, and it'll help you find your point of difference, like what is different about what you do, what is special about what you do. So, and it will also help you shape your messaging. So weighing up the competition is really important. And how do you do that? Well, first off, you know, make a bit of a map. A map might sound a bit elaborate, but basically just write it down. You know, write down all the people that you think are competitor or a comparator. You might not think, well, we're directly in competition, but they're a bit like us, so you can call them a comparator. It doesn't really matter, it's still the same process. You might want to cluster those together into groups just to kind of organize it so it's not a mega list. And it might look something like this for library services. I'm not saying this is exhaustive, but it might be you're thinking, well, people could access books from a bookshop. The internet is a competitor to us, even though internet services are likely to be part of the library offer anyway. Online shopping, second-hand books, people sharing things, friends and families could be a competitor. A cafe, if you're promoting the library service very much as a kind of informal space that people can, social space, then cafes and other places may be a competitor to you. So get them written down. And then the grey box on the right is some of the things that you may want to assess yourself against. And that doesn't have to be massively overly complicated, but just kind of think about it in terms of cost. It might be that cost, okay, well, we're offering book lending services at no cost, so we're going to be better in terms of bookshops compared to cost. What about speed? How quickly can people access services? How much quickly can they join, become a member? What's the variety of choice like? How prestigious is this to do? What's our expertise? And you see, there'll be other things in that grey box to add, but just run a bit of a comparative exercise against you and the competition will really help you focus in on what's special about your service, and be really honest with yourself, because your audience will be. There's no, there's not, unfortunately, in terms of marketing, not massive sort of loyalty out there sometimes. So people will be kind of thinking, oh, well, I can just borrow a book this way, or it's quicker for me to go here. So be really honest about your service, and it will really help in terms of your marketing and campaign planning. Okay, so that is the end of the first section, and there may not be questions, there may be some questions, but I thought we'd just stop there, and I'll just stop sharing as well, and then we can just see if there's any questions before we move on to the next section, which is all about kind of your market offer. So if there are any questions, I'm just going to open up the chat.
There's no questions that have appeared in the chat yet.
Right, thanks. Hi, Faith. I'm happy to soldier straight on, but I'll just give it one minute in case there's any.
Hello, Chris. I do have a question, actually. Hi, my name's Mel, and I work as a freelancer in this space for different, often charities and sometimes other organisations. But my question is, I recently had to help do campaign planning for a crowdfunder for a museum, and when you set out there the idea of mapping out all of your competitors, it makes sense. It's a really good idea. But my question is, what happens if it feels like you're competing against lots and lots of different organizations and almost like a culture? So in this case, there was already an organization I was working with that wanted to crowdfund for their museum. They already had an internal colleague culture of staff doing their own individual fundraisers for their own charity interests. And that's a really wide range thing. That was a normal part of the culture. But there was resistance at the organizational level to actually work with that, to kind of say, you now either need to or should be persuaded to work to support our crowdfunder rather than put efforts to supporting other charities and other organizations. And then in terms of the external competition, it was like the whole museum space. All museums are our competition. That clearly, isn't helpful in starting to plan what was a very ambitious crowdfunder because of the nature of the organization, which is not a cultural organization in itself, but was starting this museum. So if you had that kind of brief, and as much as I can't tell you who the organization was, what would you advise where to start with that?
Yeah, it's a big question. I'll do my best to give a quite quick answer, and I don't know how helpful it will be, but it's partly because I had a conversation this very morning actually with a cultural organization who is finding the competition quite hard, because they're surrounded by other offers that are as good or not better, being blunt, than theirs. And so it's kind of like, well, how do they stand out in that crowd? Because their feeling was they can't really compete necessarily. And so our advice to them was actually, they're probably right. And so the best thing to do is to partner up with the people that they're considering to be competition at the moment, because actually there was some mutual benefit in doing that. And so actually doing a bit more of a collaboration partnership effort, if you can find something that's mutually beneficial for both, which in this case we could find a way that actually, by in a way promoting what we consider to be the competition, everyone wins if we get it right. And so that was the solution there. So sometimes you have to be honest with yourself. If the competition's too stiff, then you need to think about a different way of progressing what you need to progress. Or, you know, you slightly change the offer, because the other option we had then was like, actually, could you bring something in here that's new, that will actually fundamentally change your offer, but will actually position you really, really well. So I think it's thinking around it, because sometimes, yeah, you're right, the competition is too complex, there's too many people to necessarily stand out in a normal competitor analysis. I don't know if that helps, but hopefully maybe we can carry on with that one offline if not.
Thank you.
There's a couple of extra questions that have come in, if it'd be helpful. Hello everybody, by the way, I'm Faith from Creative Concern. I joined a few minutes late, but I'll be talking to you shortly, taking on some of the presentation. I'll read through a couple of these questions that have come through. So we've got one from Paul Eves. At what point do you define success? What success looks like? For example, if your campaign is to recruit more members, when should you start thinking about how many new members would equal success? We actually cover objectives shortly, actually. So we're going to be covering objectives and the importance of that, and the importance of kind of defining that in the slides that are following. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of plan that out for you over the next few minutes. A question in from Nikki Lum. Do you find it difficult to get those involved to focus on the planning stage? Previously, many people seem to get to the part where they choose leaflets, logos, etc. So engagement, Chris, I don't know whether you want to take that one briefly. Yeah, okay, so very briefly on the when to set your kind of marks of success. Definitely, we're going to definitely cover that. So we're not ignoring that. As Faye said, we're definitely going to cover that later on. We've got some sort of tips and advice around that. In terms of the planning part, engaging people in that, you are 100% right. Everybody loves a good creative session where they're looking at imagery and logos and thinking about kind of the look and feel of things, and find it less engaging to kind of get involved in the kind of nuts and bolts of sort of planning out a campaign. So, you know, we've come up with a few techniques to kind of make that a bit more interesting and fun, deliberately, really, to try and engage people in that early part of the process, because it is super critical. Because how on earth do you know what, and you're taking your question here, what the leaflet's going to look like if you don't know what the point of doing the whole thing is in the first place. So it is hard, but you do need people to kind of rewind and try and find some creative ways to engage them in the process of doing the planning. And hopefully this webinar will help. And in the creative session we've got coming up, not today, another day, we'll actually use some techniques. I've got some techniques in there which make the creative process more fun and involving, but actually it's about strategy. It's not just about the visuals, it's actually about the strategy that underpins it. So we'll touch on it today, and then the second session, don't have a date for that yet, we'll definitely cover it in more detail.
Thank you.
Great. There's a couple more questions that have popped in, Chris. Do you want to take one more and then try and keep going just in terms of time? And any questions that we don't get to, we can certainly respond to offline. We're saving all the chat off the back of this, so we'll save all the questions, respond to them offline, and or possibly in the next phase of questions. Yeah. So there's a question here from Karen, which is around campaigns that have no budget, and can campaigns still be successful with no budget?
Fortunately, yes. So, I mean, I think no budget, I can see, actually, I'm just trying to find that one. It looks like, apart from time, so yeah, things take time, so time is money. So there's always some need for a budget, but in terms of do you need to put an advertising spend behind things? No, not necessarily. It certainly helps. I mean, I think one thing to bear in mind, particularly on social media channels, is of course they're incredibly powerful. They are commercial channels. Yes, they are great tools that we can use for free, but ultimately they are commercially driven, and therefore the results that you get using some spend behind them is quite different to using them organically and free. But if you've got a message and a service that appeals to an audience and you can reach them on a particular channel, it doesn't always mean you have to put money behind it, but it certainly helps. So don't feel despondent if you're thinking this isn't relevant to me because I've got no budget. Also, I think the powerful thing is if you can prove something that works, then often you can secure more budget off the back of that success, even if it's been success that you've generated without a budget. So in short, yes. Okay, thanks everybody. Yeah, I'll screen share and carry on if that's okay, and then Faith will take over shortly. So Hopefully that is full screen. Brilliant. Okay, so now we're looking at your market offer. Now let me just close down the chat, excuse me. Okay, brilliant. Okay, looking at your offer, which I think will probably answer a couple of your questions or related to them anyway. So what we talked about in terms of your market offer, what we're looking at is, you know, basically, what do you offer that others can't? And I saw a question in the chat about point of difference, and this is really picking up on that thread. So, you know, is there something that you do that is different to others or feels different? It doesn't have to be completely unique, but the way that you do it or the experience of taking on that service or offer feels different. What benefit does this have to your audience? So starting to write those things down really helps, because it might be you've got a really long list, but actually when you start to look at it, you're thinking, well, this is very common, lots of people do this, but these 2 or 3 things, actually they're things that you can't get elsewhere. These are very much about us and our service, and that's starting to identify your point of difference. It's what stands out from the market. And it's also a way then of basically looking at how good is your product or service that you're promoting. It sounds like a couple of people might have joined. They're not on mute. If you don't mind going on mute, that would just be great until we get to the questions bit. Thanks so much. So the next bit in terms of thinking about your offer is what we call your brand magnetism, which sounds a bit of a fancy phrase, but what it really means is, why do people love your service? So there'll be certain things that you do that you'll receive positive feedback from, and you'll know that it really works. And that might be anecdotal, like people just let you know. It might be that you've had some feedback on a feedback form, on an email, or on social media, or anything. It might be friends and family that you just know that they say this is the best thing that you do. I don't mean you personally, although it could be that. It's more likely to be your service. And that's what you call your brand magnetism. That's the things that people will come back and want to experience again and again. It's the stuff that really makes you stand out. That's really important stuff to write down. And so are the barriers. So what's stopping people enjoying your service? Now, obviously, we've had a massive barrier in the last, whatever it is now, 15, 16 months in terms of COVID, and fingers crossed that we're moving through and out of that now. But that might still be one of them. So go write it down. It's really important. But there might be other barriers that are stopping people accessing your service. It's really important not to kind of just brush over those. It's important to get those written down, because it's the flip side to the magnetism bit. But get those written down, because it might be you can do something about them, or it might be that actually you need to confront them head on as part of your campaign, or it might be they're a myth, that people think one thing about you, but actually it's not true, and you can use that as part of your pushing your marketing activity. So that's super important as well, and really help in terms of finding what's different about you and what's really going to stick in terms of your audience. Next up is about setting some campaign objectives. And we've touched on this already, and you've probably, at the point you've got your brief earlier on, you've probably already got this written down to a degree, but this section really is kind of like how to flesh those out a bit. And it's super simple, really. The SMART rule of objective setting, which I'll unpack in a second. I'm sure you've all heard of setting SMART objectives, and I don't always like these kind of mnemonic things to kind of think about quick ways of memorizing formulas, but this one does really work. I think SMART objectives, you can't go too far wrong, and it really does avoid the objectives being too broad, you know, fuzzy and unprovable. So SMART is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound, and easy to remember. And it does work, because so many times we've kind of thought of objectives for a campaign, run it past this and gone, actually, you know what, it's not actually achievable, that, or it's not actually as super relevant, or, you know, we can't put an end date on this. So, you know, make sure it's tangible and specific. Make sure you'll be able to measure it once it's met, because if not, how on earth are you going to prove your campaign works? Don't come up with a target that's so out there. So, you know, 100% of Londoners, we want them to be members of a library service. It's probably not going to happen, that. So, you know, give yourself a target that's based on the performance of your service. So, you know, that might be that you've got, I don't know, 20%, 15% of the population of your area are taking part in a particular service. And you might be able to know that that's going up on 1% a year, or it's going down 1% a year. I don't know. But so when you're thinking about an achievable target, give you something that's realistic. So that might be around kind of go, let's try and increase by 3%. Let's be modest about this, because we can always, if we beat that, we can up the ante next time. So give yourself something that's achievable and realistic, and that you can prove it's going to work. Make sure it's relevant. So make sure it fits in with your wider plans. There's always a wider plan and strategy. There's no point running a campaign that doesn't fit. So keep it relevant. and give yourself a time frame. So it's a really simple formula, that, but it does actually work in terms of target setting. So next up, we're looking at audiences. So in terms of audience, this is super important in terms of thinking about audience targeting and audience segmentation, which sounds a bit fancy, but in essence, it's about separating your audience into buckets, if you like, into categories. And it helps you keep really focused on the target audience, which is important. And ultimately, good targeting results in more success and a higher return on investment. So that's the reason to do it. And in terms of audience, just a kind of obvious one, but the general public isn't an audience. You know, any brief that comes to us, and I'd recommend the same to you, if people say we just need to target the general public, that isn't an audience. I mean, even brands who spend hundreds of millions of pounds a year on marketing would not have the general audience, sorry, the general public as an audience. They will target and segment within it. It's not to say that your service isn't available to everybody, but this is about a marketing campaign. So yeah, good targeting results in a higher return on investment. And it means you can connect your audience to a relevant message, and that's got to be good for the audience, and it's got to be good for you as well. And why do we do that? You know, we're not all robots. We are motivated by different things. So what inspires and motivates one person to act is going to be different to somebody else. So we all have different needs and wants and desires, and therefore we can't treat everybody exactly the same. So audience segmentation means that you can target people relevantly, and you know, with messages they want to receive. So where do you start with audience segmentation? And so there's a few sort of top tips here to hopefully keep this quite simple. Basically use the data you have. Everyone's got some data on their audience. It might be a bit crude, it might be a bit basic, but start with what you have. Use your own intuition as well. Don't just use your own intuition, but you'll have a view, and your colleagues have a view about the audiences that you already have and the audiences you need to reach. You can also ask the audience about kind of their feelings about why they take part in a service or why they don't. So, you know, you can potentially ask the audience to build on that data that you have. And there's a few tools out there to help you as well. I'll explain a couple of those shortly. Involve your team in the exercise, and also be realistic. And what I mean by be realistic, it's kind of like, don't just go for audiences because you feel like that you feel like there's a gap. I mean, it's fine to sort of think, well, there's a gap. We don't have a particular age group or particular type of audience, so we need to fill that gap. But always ask yourself why you're doing that. Just make sure you ask in terms of your audience that it's appropriate. So you might want to target a particular audience because you don't have that audience grouping coming to your service. You need to ask yourself, well, is it really relevant to them? Why are we targeting those people? So asking why, I think, really, really helps. And then in terms of different ways of looking at audiences, I'll just run through these briefly, but there's lots of different ways that you can start to segment it. And the brilliant thing about particularly doing a digital campaign with that social media, online, digital advertising, is there's lots and lots of ways now that we can target audiences really, really specifically. So you can look at audiences in terms of age. You can look at audience in terms of life stage, whether they have children or whether they're retired or so on. So we can target people in terms of their life stage, their gender, their occupation, whether they've got a particular religious affinity, their social economic groups. So all these demographics are available to us in terms of targeting. And we can also target geographically. So anybody who's done any sort of social media advertising will know that you can target people really quite specifically now in terms of their proximity to a particular place, their postcode, a wider area, a city, a country, a language. So geography is another option. And for a locally based service, targeting geographically is obviously makes a lot of sense. And attitudes. So attitudinal targeting is really, really powerful. And again, a lot of the social media platforms have this in terms of targeting particular lifestyles, values, personality types, hobbies, interests, likes. So all of this stuff, you will start to, in effect, have a bit of a profile for the sorts of people that you want to target. And that might be as simple as people that, you know, have highlighted that they really love reading, for example, or that they're learning a particular new skill. There's so many bits of targeting you can do now within the social media, particularly the interfaces there. And so you thinking that through about the type of person and their lifestyle will really help you in terms of your campaign targeting. Behavioural targeting is another option. So you might want to, for example, target people who have got lapsed membership, or people who very frequently visit a service or don't frequently visit. you might be able to target people with a particular level of engagement with you, or they can, people who've indicated that they're happy to be communicated with via text, for example. So there's quite a lot of things you can do in terms of their behaviour and interaction with you that can build up a behavioural profile that will help with your audience planning. So there's lots of different options there. I'm aware there's quite a lot there, but I think just beginning to think through audiences, not one big group, but groups within groups, and groups you can really filter down and refine, will make a real difference in terms of the success of a campaign, and really get you to think about actually what are the type of people we really need to reach here. I mentioned some tools that are available to help you do this, and one of them is a tool that's been put together by the Audience Agency, and they sort of specialise in kind of targeting the cultural sector, and it's called the Audience Spectrum Segmentation. And basically they've looked at the whole of the UK and their attitudes towards culture, and they've put together 10 different audience profiles, and this data is all available online. I'll show you the link shortly. And they've given them fancy names like experience seekers and up our street and kaleidoscope creativity, which sounds very fancy, but there is a really useful set, and what it does is it shows you, explains the profile, what interests those people, geographically where they are, which is super useful for you, what their kind of preferences are in terms of sort of lifestyle and attitude, and also critically how they like to be engaged in terms of communications, and plus key statistics about how many of them there are as well. So it's the audienceagency.org/audience spectrum, but I'm pretty sure if you just googled audience spectrum, that would come up, and you can access this all for free online. So certainly have a look at that one. So, but in summary, audience targeting, it's basically about getting your message through to the right audience in the right way. And we're doing that because it'll increase your chances of engaging with them. It's as simple as that, really. So if you remember that, it'll be really helpful. And it'll make you think, and yes, it'll be sometimes a bit of a battle to really think through the audience, but it's the thing really that makes the most difference, I think, in terms of a successful campaign. So super important. So that's the end of the second section, and I'll be handing over to Faith for the next part. And I'm just going to pop out of that and see if there's any questions in the chat before we move on. The next section is looking at messaging, just so you know, in case you've got any messaging questions, that is coming up next.
There's no questions right away. If anybody wants to add any or shout up.
It's not a problem. If not, we can crack straight on.
Hold on, Chris, there might be one person. No.
I was going to say, Chris, there was an earlier question about the point of difference concept. You could go into that a little bit. I think it's from you earlier.
Yeah, so I think we hopefully unpack that a little bit more, but really that's kind of around, that's about the competition section. So you're going to have a bit of a list of things that you think, well, our service or our brand is really good at these things. These are things that really people talk about, that sort of brand magnetism. And this is what our competition does. And the point of difference really is trying to identify what are the things that we do that are either different or better, or there's less competition. So it's kind of finding what are the special attributes to your service, if you like. And that's really what the point of difference is. It's kind of like, well, what's different about our service compared to others? And if you can identify that, you can start to use that as part of the marketing offer. Brilliant. Okay. So over to you then, Faith. I'll screen share for you. Is that helpful?
Yes, please. Yeah, you'll carry on driving the slides.
And hopefully you are away now.
Well, I don't think it's not full screen yet, but as long as it clicks through, I'll be fine.
Give me one more go. Hang on.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you, Chris. And hello again, everybody. We thought we'd do a changeover halfway through so you don't get too used to just one voice through this session. So I'm going to be walking you through initially how to get the message right for your campaign. Before I do that, I thought it'd be helpful just to do a quick recap on what we've covered. So we have just explored kind of why you plan, how to assess the competition, develop a much clearer and stronger brief, finding your strengths and your points of difference, and how to look at defining your audience. But the next step in your planning is almost certainly going to be getting your message right. So there's a few key things to consider on messaging. First of all, use a message that really resonates with your audience. It makes it much more likely that they're going to respond to your campaign. And critically, think about what they want to hear as well as what you want to say. You need to get yourself out of the mode of being a broadcaster that just tells them what it is that you need them to hear, and think more about how they're going to receive it and what it is that they want to hear from you. It'll make it much more audience specific and relevant to them. Be really clear about what you want from people. That sounds obvious, but it's something that doesn't always happen in a lot of campaigns, and people end up being left unsure about why you were talking to them in the first place. And then also be selective. So the temptation, certainly with things like a service like yours, where there's so much going on and there's so many things that you want to talk about and share, the temptation is to really try and pile a lot of that information in at the first contact point. That doesn't tend to resonate with people particularly well. So choose 1 or 2 messages that you think will have the most impact with your audiences to open the door initially. That doesn't mean that you can't then start to communicate with them around the wider offer through further contact points, but don't bombard them with everything. Open the door with the most compelling message that you can think of, and you will hopefully engage them. There's a few different techniques that we use as an agency and we use with our clients quite often to help really work through messaging. So we wanted to share those with you today, because hopefully they will be useful for you as well. The first one to talk through is what we call think, feel and do. And in your situation, in the case of kind of developing library marketing campaigns, it's really good to think about, so what do you want audiences to know about your service? What information do you want them to retain, and what is it that you want them to think about the audience? So what information, core information, needs to be communicated? Then what emotion do you want to evoke in your audience? Emotion plays an important part in marketing. Of course it does. We know that. So what is it you want your audiences to feel after they've encountered your campaign or your piece of marketing? You might want them to feel excited and inspired. You might want them to feel angry and motivated to act because they felt enraged by a situation or frustrated. You might want them to feel nostalgic. There's loads of different ways that you can evoke emotion through marketing campaigns, but think about what emotional connection you want people to have with you, as well as just the information that you're sharing. And then I've mentioned it already, but it's really important to think about what you want people to actually do. Be clear and open with them about what action you need them to take. Another technique that we often use when we're workshopping with clients around messaging, or when we're thinking through messaging challenges back in the office, in the agency, is what we call the head, hand and heart. Now, head, hand and heart is not unique to us. You might have encountered something like this before. It's a well-used model, but it works really well for us, and certainly in this situation, because what we found is often the best marketing campaigns contain all 3 of those ingredients, albeit that sometimes they're in different measures. The head part for us is a reminder to always include the kind of rational part to the campaign message. So the facts or the reasoning behind the campaign or behind what you're saying. Make sure that you appeal to people's kind of rational information side. The heart, again, is that emotional connection. So you can certainly put a poster up with the facts about your service, but it won't have very much emotional connection, and therefore it's not likely to stick with people in the way that something with a more emotional element can do. So what is it that you're going to do to make the campaign feel personal and memorable, that it'll touch people? And the hand, again, is all about action. So again, it's another reminder to us to never forget within your campaign messaging that you need a really clear call to action. What is the audience being asked to do? And is what you're asking them to do reasonable? Is it too big an ask for that audience, or is it something that they feel that they can achieve, and therefore you can start to build on with them in the future? On the next slide, we've got a bit of an example, actually. This is an example of some evolving campaign messagery that we're working on for London libraries at the moment. And I thought it'd be really lovely to share it with you, albeit it is in draft, because it sort of shows how we've used that model to make sure that we've got those core elements in the messaging. So the heart element is coming through direct quotes in this instance about someone's passion or the impact that libraries have made, or we've got a line that's evolving around discovering the power of libraries. That's quite an emotional and evocative copy line, which makes people feel something rather than just know something. We're trying to really nail the head part of the messaging there. We're giving the location, we're giving how many libraries there are, which is really important to their offer, and also nailing those open, which they haven't been for a while for obvious reasons, so that they're now open, they're welcoming people back, and they're free, which is another key differentiator. So we're really trying to work in that head element of the messaging, and then the hand as well. So we have a clear call to action. In this instance, it might be a sign up to receive something that is an incentive. It's a data capture campaign potentially. So what is it that you're asking people to do? So I thought it'd be helpful to see that kind of coming to life a little bit. It's a great model. It's another one that can work really well when you are workshopping with teams. So I'm afraid I can't remember the person's name who said, do we struggle to engage wider colleagues in some of the planning? And yes, you can do, but if you have some techniques like this, you can actually encourage people to get involved because it feels a bit more interesting and engaging. So the head, hand, heart model in a workshop can really fire people's minds up and get people a bit more engaged. There's lots of other practical tips behind sort of the development of messaging for campaigns, and we've mapped some of these out here for you. Some are reasonably obvious, but important to bear in mind. Keeping it audience focused, we've already touched on, and less is often more, bearing in mind that people rarely dedicate more than a few seconds to a piece of marketing that they aren't already engaged in. So you do need to make sure that you are being succinct and nailing that one or two key message rather than overwhelming. The big thing for me that I think is really important and we haven't touched on yet is around testing. And often if you're going to be doing any testing, people will think about testing creative. So they'll come up with a couple of designs and they'll either do some informal testing, or if budget allows, they'll do focus groups or what have you. But testing messaging is also really important. So even if that is in an informal way, if that's even just within your office or with colleagues from other areas of the team that you work in, try and get some external input in terms of the messaging to make sure that what you think you're saying is coming across, because quite often when we work day in and day out in a service, we understand it so well, we assume everybody else does as well. So do your best to do some testing. We have seen clients certainly over the last 18 months, because everything is so much more digital now and people are able to engage through Zoom sessions and so on much more easily. We've seen clients setting up informal testing groups, so that's certainly something to consider as well. If you have service users that you think would engage, think about setting up a marketing testing group, which can be quite informal, but that you can share things with and use them to get perspective. And also, if you are doing activity on social, if you're doing any paid for activity, so social adverts, you can also consider what they call A/B testing, which will be very familiar, I'm sure, to some of you. But effectively, it's running two creatives or messages or versions of a piece of campaign collateral for a short period of time, so you can get insight to see what works and which one is better. So there's different ways that you can test out messaging as well as creative, and it's always really beneficial. So I'm going to walk you through now another really key part of planning, which is about selecting and refining the channels that you use and the tactics that you deploy as well. The first thing to do, and it's something that we always do, is start with a really long list. So it's really helpful, and again, this is something you can do as a team if you want to engage other people, is just start with that long list and as many ways as you can think of to reach your audience. Not all of them are going to be available or appropriate to you, but just mapping them out in the first instance can help unlock unexpected channels that you maybe wouldn't have thought of if you hadn't have done this exercise. Once you've done that, you do have to consider a few elements for sure. First of all, obviously, which is going to best help you reach your audience? Are there channels that your audience will be engaging with, and are there some channels where your audience is not likely to be? This is why having a really clear understanding of who your audience is valuable here, because it helps you make good strategic decisions as you go through the planning process. So, for example, if you're aiming to reach young professionals to promote the library as a new workspace, as an alternative to working from home, maybe, you need to be thinking about where they're most likely to be spending time right now, and what they'd respond best to. That might be digital advertising if it's really properly targeted, or they might respond better to some influencers who they already trust. And they might respond better to that than flyers or posters in a community centre or activity that you're setting up in the library itself, and so on. So some obvious points there, but I think it is really relevant to think about kind of targeting that. Also think practically, also think practically about which channels you have access to and that aren't going to require you to have a huge amount of ongoing investment to maintain. This is really important for social channels, and very often when clients have small marketing budgets, or their budget is predominantly their time, we recommend in terms of social, don't set up an account on every social channel. Select one or two and run those really well. So don't be tempted to set up a new channel if you don't think that you are going to be able to maintain that in the long term, because the reality is any momentum that you might have built up through a campaign activity will be lost long term because you haven't been able to manage or maintain that. And the other thing is really consider how much monitoring and evaluation that you can do over a particular channel. So again, digital is a dream for this often, because you can get often a lot of information back about how those channels are performing, which can help you make a really good case on an ongoing basis for future investment and so on. But even if you are using some channels that are non-digital, think about how you're going to track and measure the success of those channels so that you're learning all the time from the campaign work that you're doing. Remember as well, some of you might have seen this diagram or a version of this diagram at least before. It's a well-referenced one, and something that we find really useful to remind us that some channels work brilliantly well for mass reach, but they don't allow for very close targeting. And for other channels, the opposite's true. So if you want to run a really general awareness or brand building campaign, a billboard, for example, would work really well, some outdoor advertising, but there's going to be much less ability to target that channel very specifically into a specific audience. Whereas if you were using, for example, a piece of paid for social advertising, or even an invite only event or an email campaign, you'll reach far fewer people, but you will be able to make much more of the targeting and speak much more directly to people. So decide what it is that you're trying to achieve with your campaign and help that inform the channels that you're using. They're not all made equally. It's also important to have in mind the purpose of the channel that you're using. And on the next slide, we kind of explain what that means a little bit. So some channels lend themselves best to storytelling or inspiring people or forging that kind of emotional connection. And some channels are better suited to providing clear information without lots of stories or emotion. So if you're clear why you're selecting the channel that you are, you'll be able to check that it fits with your overall vision for the campaign. It's a kind of a check back really to make sure that the channel fits with where you're trying to go with the campaign and what you're trying to achieve. So once you've shortlisted those channels, you can get much more specific, and this is where the detail of your planning will come in. So, for example, rather than just saying you'll run over social media, really identify which of those channels you're going to be running on. Identify the types of content that you're likely to need. This is another really good proof point, actually, for whether your channel is right for you, because if you don't have access to the kind of content that really sings on that particular channel, it might not be the channel for you unless you've got money or time to invest in creating some new content. So think about that and think, we'd love to do something on, for example, YouTube. Do we have great video content or the means to make it? Because even if your audience is on YouTube at the moment, if you don't have the means to really make the most of that channel, it won't be a good investment for you. Similar example actually that we see sometimes is Instagram. So Instagram performs well in lots of campaigns, and at one point it was really the place to have a presence for your brand, but not all brands or organizations are very visual. And if you don't have a really strong visual brand, or if you don't have assets that really lend themselves to what is very much predominantly a visual format, you'll struggle and you won't get the traction on something like Instagram that you need. So you either need to invest in creating that content, or you need to move on to something where you can play to your strengths a little bit more. So that leads right on to thinking about content on the channel and making sure that you've got the right kind of content, as I've just said, for the channel that you're using. So this is an example that we've mapped out here just for YouTube. You know, thinking as creatively as you possibly can to come up with some really rich content that will sync on those channels and will make the most of them. But that goes for all channels really. So for example, if you're wanting to engage people through an event, have you got a really strong speaker or panel? Do you have a really great point of difference for that event? Have you got an event structure that's going to really engage people and excite them and motivate them to the point where they want to act with you? It's not enough to just think we're going to do a thing. You've got to really think about what you can actually service that channel with and how you can make it work. And again, as Chris has said previously, be honest, because sometimes things don't work, or you don't have the resource to enable it. And that's the point at which you can move on and think of an alternative way. It's also really helpful when you're thinking about your campaign channels and how you're going to roll your campaign out to think about it as a series of phases rather than just a single burst. So you can start to think about which channels you could use at which point, at which phase of your campaign, and potentially hold back some of your ideas or your content until a later phase so you can build up. The idea is that rather than just coming at people in one big splurge, you want to try and build up and take them on a little bit of a journey. A phased approach is also really helpful because it builds in some review points. It allows you to pause at different points in your campaign so you can actually see whether what you're doing is working. It's much better to identify issues or problem areas 2 or 3 weeks in than right at the very end of the campaign when you can't do very much to change that. So seeing your campaign building up through phases in what we're calling here a campaign arc can be really helpful. I've got an example of that on the next slide. So this just kind of shows for us why a phased campaign can be really important. It's really useful for you. As I've mentioned internally, it allows you to have breakpoints. It allows you to have review points and to kind of phase the resources that you're putting into the campaign. But it's also really important for your audience. So your audience, especially if you're going for quite a cold audience, you're trying to break into a group of people who don't currently engage with your service. At the beginning, when they first encounter your campaign, they may be completely unaware of you. They might have some awareness, but have very low levels of interest or engagement. It's not likely that they're going to go from that point of either being unaware or completely unengaged to taking quite a significant action, which is where you might eventually want them to be in one step. None of us do that, especially when we're talking about our own behaviours, when we're talking about behaviour change campaigns, which in lots of ways this is. Unless there's a massively strong incentive at play, and I don't think you're going to be paying people to come into the libraries at any point soon. So what we've got to do instead is build it up incrementally and give them different opportunities to engage with you, and have asks of them along the way that feel proportionate to where they are in their relationship with you. So rather than doing an immediate kind of sign up for your library, come in, do this straight away, if you've got people that have never been to the library before, what can you ask them to do that feels a little bit more reasonable, that there's a bit more achievable on the way, and build that up through the campaign. On the next slide, we've got an example of that from a campaign, not libraries related, but that we've run relatively recently. But it just shows how we do use that campaign arc very actively in our own planning of campaigns. This is a recent charity campaign that we ran. So you can see there, it started with letters to supporters, launching a web page, some digital advertising. We had a pause point, we had a review point, we did some PR, then we did another phase of digital advertising because we learned from what worked in the first phase and we saw where the message was starting to evolve to. More letters, some on-site and event activity, another review point, some more PR, and then we built up gradually to the point where we had a bit of a crescendo of the campaign. This was super helpful, as I say, internally for us. We could actually tweak what we were doing based on what we had seen happening before. We weren't totally committed to it all in one go, and it took people on a journey with us, so that by the time that we got further into the campaign, they were much more willing to give us more than they would have been at the beginning. They were much more willing to commit, give us time, and a bigger commitment from themselves than they ever would have been if we'd have made the ask right at the very beginning back in March. So the last bit of the presentation and the last part that I'll walk you through is a quick word really on incentives and how you can nudge your audiences to take action. So Chris? Thank you. So getting your call to action right is super important. We've mentioned this a couple of times, at least this morning, but it's because it's so important. If the ask that you're making of people isn't realistic, if it doesn't feel like it's achievable for them where they are now, it may not work and your campaign is possibly not going to be a success. This is, for me, where consumer campaigns and behaviour change campaigns really differ. You're not selling something here, so you're not tapping into people's kind of just click it and buy it and act on impulse. You're asking people to make a much more fundamental change to their behaviour potentially, and that for them can often feel like you're asking them to change a little bit of who they are. It's arguably a much bigger ask, and that's why you have to approach it in a slightly different way. People do not take action often just because you've asked them to, and so you often have to provide them both with smaller steps that are achievable, and also with some reasons to change. So on the next slide, we map out what some of those smaller calls to action might be. So there's going to be lots and lots and lots of these, lots of ways that you can ask people to act in a way that feels like, okay, we could do that, we could achieve that. A sign up we've got there. It's a bit of a word of warning actually on sign ups. Asking people to sign up to a mailing list. Could you go back, Chris, please? Asking people to sign up to a mailing list is actually quite a big ask these days. People are cautious with their personal data. They are less willing to provide their email addresses. And so that isn't a super, super simple basic ask for sure. And it needs a bit of thinking, which we'll get to in a minute, about how you can kind of encourage people to do that. Following though on social media is a slightly less committed ask. Sharing content as well is again slightly less committed ask that you can ask people. Read more though. Give your campaign 30 seconds of their time by clicking through to read a bit more on a web page. It might be the starting point that you want to have with your audiences. Visit your website and take a bit of time to connect with them. If you can then really refine the content that you direct them to, you've got a chance of getting them to jump to the next step, to do the next thing. They've read something and now they feel like they want to take a next action. To always follow up with something else that they can do, and refer to others as well, you know, pass the word on and so on. So think about what you think is proportionate in that moment, in that contact point with your audiences, and then build that up. Always give them something else that they can do to keep the action going, but don't try and take the step all in one big leap. So in reality though, and I mentioned this very briefly when I was talking about sign-ups, it's often true that the best way to ask for something is to give something as well. And so the next slide kind of reiterates that, to be honest. If people can see that they'll also benefit And ideally, if that benefit is kind of instantly gratifying in some way, they may be more likely to act. Now, for services like yourselves, that can sometimes be a bit of a head scratcher, because, as I say, you're not offering people a new pair of shoes or something that they can just click and feel good about for a minute or two after they've made the purchase. But there are still ways that you can incentivize actions to encourage people to take the action that you want, or at least engage with you in some way. It's definitely what we call the kind of carrot approach to campaign marketing, offering something to people to entice them in and to make them feel like they're getting something back from you, as well as taking action for you. Now, more carrots on the next slide, and that is for good reason, because it's also worth remembering when you are developing kind of incentives or trying to incentivize action, that not everybody will be incentivized by the same thing. So it's really important to have a range of different ideas, and again, to test and trial what works. You know, don't invest hugely down one route. Don't buy 10,000 tote bags and hope that that's going to bring the masses in. It might do some work, but it might not appeal to everybody. So make small investments, try different things in terms of incentives, and consider what those things could be. I know I keep saying the word incentive, and it's hard to kind of quantify that, isn't it, without giving some practical examples. So for other campaigns that we've run recently for local authorities and for charities, examples have been where we've actually offered a free guide to a related issue. When we've run fostering recruitment campaigns, for example, what we need from them is their data. We need their email address so that the fostering team can start to contact them and engage them and hopefully move them along the journey to ultimately apply to be a foster carer. But those people want something back in return. They don't just want to give us their data. So we offered a free guide to fostering. It kind of gave them all the information that, in honesty, they could probably have sourced from somewhere else. But it was packaged up. It was something instantly gratifying, and that kind of felt like they got something of value back in return. And that turned out to be a really useful tool, and really helped boost the data capture for that particular campaign. We've also run campaigns where the incentive has been some lovely kind of creative resources. So we've run campaigns where we've offered kind of educational stuff or stuff for families, creative resources and so on, because that was fitting for that particular audience, or some information that can't be easily found elsewhere, information that we've curated especially, and that people will see some value in. So for yourselves, have a think about what it is that you could offer to people. It doesn't have to be bits and bobs. You don't have to be adding to piles of plastic. Often people value information or curated content as much as they would, or more than they would, a little giveaway. Although, you know, giveaways are something that since time immemorial have been factored into marketing campaigns as well. So think about that in context of your audience and what they might value, and things like competitions as well, which is again a classic, but not something to forget completely. So I have rattled through loads more there, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. I've deliberately not been on chat. Chris has been keeping an eye on the chat, I think, as I've been going through that, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can now, because we're towards the end of our kind of presentation part of the session today. What you're seeing here is just a reminder of everything that we have been through, those building blocks for your campaign planning. So briefing, developing that brief in a really creative and collaborative way, how to map out competitors, how to map out your audiences, how to get really clear on what you offer and what your objectives of your campaign are, and then taking that through to the more practical aspects of the channels and the incentives and so on. We just wanted to leave you with some final thoughts, mindful really as well that this has been a kind of big burst of information coming at you for the last hour or so. So planning is super important. It is at the heart of all successful campaigns for sure. Test where you can. I've mentioned this already. Build as much testing in as you can do, and that's both before you launch your campaigns, but also learn and look from what's working and what's not, so that you can really feed into future activity with that information. yes, do what works and slough off the things that don't work, but also try new stuff as well. It doesn't just go for the incentives where you need to have lots of different ideas and ranges of trials and errors of things. It goes right the way across the campaign development piece. Try new things, and most importantly, enjoy the process, because this should be inspiring and fun for you. And if it isn't, it probably won't be for your audiences either. So make sure that what you're working on feels right for you and feels enjoyable and engaging for your team, because then you will most likely have something that is going to also translate through your communications to your audiences. So thank you for listening to all of that, and especially to a big block of Chris and then a big block of me. We had to do that, I'm afraid, because of the point that I joined the session. We couldn't break it up differently, but hopefully that has been helpful. And I think now's the point to kind of return to chat. Chris, have you got any starter questions that we can get stuck into from the chat?
Yeah, definitely. So there's quite a few things going on here, but one of the earlier ones was around our views in terms of using humour. So I'm trying to find the person who put that, but basically there was a question around, is humour a good idea? So some people have been encouraged to use humour in previous training kind of exercise around marketing, and I'm sure you've got a view on that, Faith, and if not, I'll dive in. So the use of humour.
Go for it.
Okay. It's a very good question. I think we have used humour quite a bit in our campaigns for different topics. I think it's very personal. So what you folks out there will find funny might be different to me. And so the risk is that it falls flat with a large chunk of people, because we all have different takes on what is humorous. So I suppose it's trying to find, if you're going to use humour, just be careful, because it's very easy to tip into kind of causing offence, also just not working because it falls flat. So it's trying to find, yes, humour, of course it's okay, it's a kind of universal thing, but it's also a personal thing. So that comes back to Faith's point around sort of testing. So, you know, if you ran a focus group, an informal one it could be, and you showed some quite humorous kind of ideas, and 10 out of the 12 people find it funny, you're probably all right. Well, as if it's 6 out of the 12, maybe it's not quite going to rock in terms of a campaign concept. So you just need to be super sensible about it, really. But I don't think it's the case that humour works more effectively than other emotional sentiments. I think that is something that sometimes marketing people trot out, and I don't actually believe it, to be honest. So that's a good question. We've got lots more here. Hang on a sec.
There's a question about tools to be able to capture long lists of channels. I'm not sure whether this is really what was meant, and if it wasn't, please clarify and we can come back to it. But at the moment, we are doing lots and lots of collaborative working over Zoom, over Teams, this kind of thing. We've taken all our workshops onto digital channels and so on. And one of the tools that works super well for that, so if you have a team of people and you need them all to be inputting in and so on, we use Mural. So it is a lovely collaborative working online tool which allows loads of people to dive in, work on the same workspace at the same time. It uses cute little post-it notes and other graphics that enable people to really collaborate. It's really helpful as a facilitator, because that's probably the role that you would mostly be playing like us, because you don't have to be the one that writes everything. And it also enables you to filter stuff and move stuff around, and people can do some really lovely cool stuff on the Mural boards. So that's Mural, and it's definitely a good digital collaboration tool that we've been using quite a lot recently. So
now. I said lunchtime.
For things like for things like that, or for any of the workshopping that you're trying to do and engaging colleagues, I would recommend using something like that, where people can actually get stuck in the same way as if they had flip chart paper and pens. You're trying to evoke the same response.
Okay, so there's another question here actually about 2 or 3 people have mentioned about Facebook engagement, and I presume it's more of a broader question actually around social media engagement. And I think it's a really good point, and there's not one magic answer for this. So the question was around people posting quite a lot of interesting content and different diverse content on Facebook pages and social media, asking for people to engage in some way, and people struggling to sort of generate that engagement and get that kind of conversation going. So I'm sure that is a common experience for quite a lot of people. And I think, you know, the reality is now, with the proliferation of social, that actually there are so many channels and feeds that people follow. So in the early days, people would often have a much smaller group of sites or brands or organizations that they would interact with. And likewise, so would other people. So you might be interacting with 10, 20, 30 people. And therefore, the level of engagement was very, very high. Nowadays, because often people have built up quite significant followings, or, you know, it's very easy to click and follow other people, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to actively engage in all of those channels. But one thing I would say is that it's important to keep going, because often we've had experience in terms of us personally, our own channels, where we've kind of thinking, oh, there's, you know, not many people reacted to this, not many people kind of necessarily like this. And then you'll bump into someone and say, oh, I saw all that stuff you were doing on Instagram, really brilliant, great work. And you kind of think, oh, people, you know, people are out there enjoying the content. So it isn't just about engagement on social. It has a very important purpose in terms of telling people and keeping people informed about what you're doing. And some people now, in terms of social, still follow and enjoy the content, but deliberately have decided not to engage because they don't want to be tracked, and they don't want to be seen to for their data to be used in that way. So there is a slight shift. And some of the social channels are exploring this as well. So you'll probably know that Instagram have been trialing posts where you can't see the number of likes. And that is likely to be something that will happen in the future. So to take away that kind of sort of drive that social has for how many likes have I got, how many likes have I got, they're looking at kind of removing that. So it's much more about giving and sharing information, not necessarily all about, you know, comments and number of likes. So it doesn't mean that the content that you're doing is wrong. Of course, it's good to try different stuff. So if you're not getting any engagement, of course, try something else. It's certainly worth a try, but don't feel disheartened, because actually there's probably more people taking notice than you realise. They're just not adding a comment to the feed. So just don't feel too disheartened about that.
I picked up a couple of questions from the chat, Chris, that I'm happy to take on whilst you're looking through. So we had a little bit of a set of questions around the incentive and the free guide. So just to clarify, actually, I gave the fostering campaign example. That wasn't a posted out physical thing. It was a downloaded document. And that was really important to us, actually. The service that we were supporting do have physical copies of their guide, and they could have posted them out. But a really key thing for us was that the incentive gave some instant gratification, that it came in instantly. So we set that up on the client's website, on their campaign landing pages that we created, so that people filled out a form, and by right of return, as soon as they clicked submit to add their contact details in there, they got sent it on an email. They got sent the PDF on an email. So if your system supports that, it's great, because it went straight into their inbox. It went an instant thing. People were downloading it and opening it as they were thinking about it, rather than that sense that it will come through in a week or so. So that was what was happening there. Somebody's asked a question as well about how that could translate to libraries, and we're actually getting stuck into that very question at the moment through our wider work. As I mentioned before, we're doing some work right now with London libraries. And what we're looking at there, we're trialing a few different possible incentives, one of which is a kind of curated reading list for people. So what do London libraries recommend? That links with other activity that's going on as well at the moment around kind of key lockdown reads. So we're looking at some key reading lists, but Libraries Connected also have some great resources about where you can find good ebooks and kind of really useful resources. As I say, it doesn't always have to be brand new that's not available anywhere else. Sometimes people will connect if it's just something that's been curated and made easy for them. So we're trialing some of that at the moment, and as I've mentioned, it's going to be a little bit of a test, because we don't know what will work and what people will be motivated to act on or not. So we're very much in kind of test mode for that, but that's what we're doing for London libraries, and we'll be, I'm sure, sharing kind of findings of that out around the Libraries Connected network. The intention is to kind of share all that learning as we're doing it. So we're kind of learning on the go with that for the library services specifically. Another question that's just popped up, sorry Chris, before I hand back to you to do a couple, and I think a few people have raised quite rightly that this is quite a comprehensive planning kind of methodology, which works really well for big campaigns. But how does that translate to the much smaller campaign activity that you're doing day to day? And are there any kind of key things, key bits that you would pull out to help when you've got much less resource and time and it's a much smaller contained campaign? I think for me, there are a couple of key things that if you don't take anything else from this, that you could filter down for those smaller pieces of activity. The first one is around being clear on action, because it's dead easy to do some great, lovely looking stuff and then forget that you actually need to act. Tell people how you want them to act and be really explicit with that. So making sure that there's always that clear call to action that again feels right and proportionate to the people that you're talking to. I think you'll be developing, no matter how small the campaign is, you will be developing some campaign messagery and look and feel. So the head, hand, heart thing I always come back to, and it is really useful because it makes sure that you get those core elements in and that you're thinking about that emotional connection as well as the kind of practical information coming across. The other aspect that I would say, and I'm not sure whether this came through actually as clearly in our main presentation, because we'll be picking this up in another session, I think, but think about where it is that you're actually directing people to for more information. So if it is digital content, and often it will be, it might just be a couple of social media posts, or it might be maybe one Facebook ad or what have you. Have a think about where it is that you're sending people to. The default often when we're kind of just racing through stuff is to just send them to the homepage of your website, send them to that landing page of your services website and send them there. Great, you know, they're there. The problem is if people have encountered you for the first time through one bit of campaign material, they know you for that. So when they click through, they're looking to see something familiar where they've clicked through. They want to see the same sort of language or focus or message. And if you pop them onto just a main general landing page, general homepage, they won't get that because your homepage of your website needs to serve a much bigger audience. So simple campaign landing pages, simple pages within your site that you can direct people in, and then you've got much more ability to kind of curate that experience for those people that have engaged. You can talk to them much more directly rather than them kind of just suddenly joining the mass through just your homepage there. So that's another kind of key thing really, is I think, where are they going and what experience did they get after they've seen that poster or that leaflet or that that ad or piece of content on social? Because for them, that could either be the end of the journey or it could be the start of a next step, and really you want it to be the start of the next step. So have a think about where your campaign goes after you've done that initial piece.
Brilliant, thanks Faith. There's quite a few of the comments here. I'm just going to wrap up. There's a few that have got a similar theme, which was around how do our services encourage people to come back physically into the library, because obviously that's a challenge for you and it's been a difficult time over the last 16 months or so on that. So it's a really good point. A few people have echoed that in their comments and questions. So how to tackle that one? I think what I would say on that is the starting point is to try and think, and you can think about it from your own point of view, put your head, if you like, into your audience's head. So what are they thinking and how can the library appeal to that? So for example, it might be that like yourselves and ourselves, lots of people have been working at home much more. So they haven't been into an office. And so therefore they might well be looking for places where they could work out of the office or just go for a day to do something different, to sit somewhere. So think about it in terms of offering a solution, really, rather than just saying, we're open, we're back, come and see us. It's okay, it's true and it's factual and it's, you know, that's what you want. But think about it in terms of benefits. So, you know, lots of us may well have been working in our children's bedrooms like me this very afternoon and might be thinking it'd be quite nice to get out and about actually. And so a library offers a space that's open and free and nice and clean and got access to things. And so it can actually be a solution to the situation we're in. And so I would try to think about it in terms of those terms. And obviously, it's also important to think, you might want to talk about the kind of COVID safe measures that you put in place. Part of me thinks that, yeah, that is important. It's kind of secondary because there'd be a massive expectation that as as a local authority service, or even as a non-local authority service, that would be an expectation. And it's not really the emotional bit that's going to get people. But what might get people is a quiet, safe space to work, somewhere different, a change of their four walls, access to, you know, 1 million books or whatever it is that you've got in your service, and the other things. And so it offers a bit of a solution, a change of scenery. So I would use the situation we're in to kind of position your service. So hopefully that will help. But also be very proud of what you're offering, and make sure that people do know that you're open, because obviously the other thing around this, in terms of all the restrictions and the changes in that, there is a simple also message in terms of reminding people that you are there and available. I think that's important as well. Just having a look through the questions. There was one about social media audit. I'm happy to pick up that one actually. So somebody asked about, in terms of social media, how should we audit ourselves, and also what should we be measuring? Really good questions. And there are a number of tools that you can use out there. I mean, in terms of free tools, I suppose the social media channels themselves are increasingly getting good at their own analytics. So Facebook's inbuilt analytics tell you quite a lot. Twitter's inbuilt analytics tell you quite a bit. Now, okay, you've got to go in and do each one separately. But in terms of a free quick solution, they're always getting better on that. Why are they getting better on that? Because they want you to advertise. So they're telling you as much as they can about your audience, trying to incentivize you to then do some paid for activity. But actually those analytics are available for free and really useful. In terms of your website analytics, also important, don't forget about those. Depending on how you're set up, you should be able to quite easily get access to either Google Analytics, is obviously the most popular one for websites. Some websites have their own inbuilt analytics as well. So also make sure you look at the website analytics to understand that traffic. There are tools like Sprout Social is one tool that we use for social media kind of analytics and planning. That is a paid for service. And I'm not recommending that necessarily above other ones, because I've spoken to lots of people who have their own particular tools that they like, but Sprout Social is certainly one that we've used and found useful, so certainly worth checking that out. And I think the critical thing really is to try and identify what matters to you, really, because the trouble is in social there's so many figures, and some of them are massive and some of them are small. It's kind of like, what does it all mean? You can get a bit lost in it all, really. But most of them have some sort of engagement rates which are quite useful. And it's not about saying, well, we should aim for a 5% engagement rate or 3% engagement rate. Benchmark yourself against yourself, because really that's the only thing that really matters here, because there's no point in you engaging in benchmarking yourself against someone either in a completely different sector or a different geography or a different service. What does it actually mean? It doesn't mean anything really. So create your own benchmarks and then build from that. So, if you're reaching X 100,000 people on social media and you want to reach more, look to yourself and set yourself a target. It's a bit like the campaign planning, it's exactly the same. And then you can kind of go, great, we've got an arc here that's going in the right direction. And I think that's it, and try and keep it, keep it simple as well. And the other thing is, one good thing to look at is the connection between social media and the website. So Faith was talking about, potentially having a campaign landing page or some place online that connects to social. The link between those things is important. So if you're wanting people to experience you on social media and then go online, you can measure how many of those people are actually taking that journey, and that's a really good measure. So in short, you have to measure everything, try and identify 2 or 3 things that really work and are relevant to you, but benchmark yourself against yourself. That's the best starting point, so you can see where you're going.
Just to add on to that very briefly, also use it to practically help you. So, for example, Chris is so right that actually diving down big, deep holes of data and information and analysis can be overwhelming and isn't always very helpful. But if you actually look at it as a way of getting better at the next bit of activity that you do, so monitoring things, for example, like what time of day posts perform best, is simple. It's relatively easy to access through the channel's own analytics, but it can give you a bit of a pointer that there's no point popping it up at 3 in the afternoon if your posts tend to get best traction in the mornings or what have you. So look for things that you think, well, I'm about to put a post out? Should I make it a video? Should I make it a static image? Should I, what length of copy should I use? And try and use it to inform what you're actually doing, and use it as a valuable tool for you, as well as a kind of way of tracking performance. And then it's there as your aid as much as anything else.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a good, someone's mentioned that they do a book butler service, which I do like the sound of that. I don't know what it means, but I think it sounds like a tailored, curated list. That sounds an excellent idea. Whoever's doing the book butler service, congratulations. I'd like to use that. That sounds exciting.
I've seen a few of those. Yeah, that sounds good.
Are there, I'm hoping we've caught all the questions. I'm just scooting back through. If anyone's got any last questions, by all means pop them on the chat now, and we'll pick those up as we're going back through the list. It sounds like getting people physically back in the library is your biggest challenge from what I can gather from the feedback at the moment. And you're not alone there in terms of the cultural sector. So,
I mean, that's also, as I keep mentioning, that's work that we're currently doing and getting stuck into that challenge for libraries in London, and so we're in the same sort of place as you of working through that challenge at the moment. The thing that makes me feel quite optimistic, and hopefully you will do as well, about this challenge, is that we're all coming off the back of such a strange period that people are reviewing quite a lot of their own behaviours, and they're open to change in quite a significant way because they've been forced to break out of habits and start to form new ones. So Chris mentioned it briefly, you know, we're working in very different ways than we were 18 months or 2 years ago, and we're already starting to think about how the future of our working life might be, and what we want the balance to be, and where we work and how, and so on. So it opens up, there's a real point of change across society at the moment, obviously, and it's opening up opportunities to get in there with new ways of being and suggest to people different ways that they could behave, and how libraries could become part of that. And critical to that, as Chris mentioned, was not just telling them about yourselves, because that's what you want them to hear, but think about what they want to hear and think about what's going to make a difference to them. So don't just say you're reopening and it's great and here are your opening hours, which you wouldn't anyway, I know, but you know, show them that you could be part of their future working situation. You could be part of the way that they start to connect with their local community. They loved making connections through lockdown, and they want to retain that and grow it, and they want to stay part of their community. Well, the library's the tool to do that. The library is the mechanism that which they can kind of keep all the good bits of the lockdown and that kind of community spirit and pull it through into the rest of their life. So frame it in a way that it's something that they want to hear and that resonates with them, as well as telling them what you need them to know, so that you've got both parts of that, and hopefully that will encourage them to be motivated. We're working through all of that ourselves as well. It's a good challenge to have, but it's a tricky one.
Great, thanks. There's a good question here around limited, well, you're running a campaign on limited budget, but specifically looking at social media is good, but what about audiences that aren't on social media? Very, very good point. And I realise we probably talked a little bit too much about social media, so it's a good challenge. And I think, what do you do then for audiences that aren't on social? There's a suggestion that it might be older members of the community. That's potentially true for sure, and looking at the statistics. So I think, you know, another exercise that we do that we didn't cover off today is we think about an audience, and so you kind of have a bit, we call an audience persona. So that might be like somebody in your local area who is over 60 years old, just say, and might live within, you know, 1 mile of the library. You can create a kind of persona of the sort of person you've got in your mind that you think, actually, we need to target these people, and we're not going to reach them on social media. And then what you start to do is, it sounds a bit of an imaginary exercise, but it's really, really powerful. It's thinking about, well, where do they go? What is their lifestyle like? Where are they? They could potentially see messages about our service throughout their week. You can do it for a day, you can from dawn till dusk, or you can do it for a week. It depends on how you want to do it. And often that's when you'll find the answer. So, for example, in my community here, out in Calderdale between Manchester and Leeds, there's a particular through the door publication that comes in, and there's little tiny adverts in it, which was cheap as chips to actually place, but it literally goes to every household. And it's one of those things that, you know, if you're looking for a plumber or someone to fix the guttering, they're all in there. But there's lots of other community news and things in there. And I would say that looking at, if it was me and it was my library service here and I was looking to target that age group, I would put something in there. So that might be, you know, it's slightly old fashioned, a little advert almost in the classified section of a local community newspaper, if you like. But I think that would be the thing that would reach that audience, and you'll have the equivalent of that, or there'll be something else. You know, people talk about, you know, free poster in the doctor's surgery or the dentist's notice board, that kind of thing. You can map out, if you think about an audience, a number of what we call touch points, which is kind of like what people are going to see, you know, where they're going to see and read. Often that's also in places where they're going to dwell. So, you know, sometimes a local community has a really community focused cafe where there's a community notice board and all that kind of stuff. That might be a great place to reach them as well. So these are relatively low cost. You know, you're talking about, you know, might be printing out some A4 posters, taking out a £50 advert in a local community magazine. It's not massive stuff, and it's thinking about that. Map out their day in your mind. Where do they go? Who do they see? And you'll probably find the solution is there, and it'll be very, very localized, but that's the point, because they are people that you've kind of got a perception of. So I think that might help in terms of thinking around the social media.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because this is something that I've worked on with a number of social housing providers, and they have a similar challenge. They have dwindling resources, and they also have a lot of people who aren't digitally enabled or confident on digital channels. A couple of things I'd say there is that actually digital can be part of the solution for those audiences, because the more people that you can get to interact with you digitally, and move as many people onto digital interaction that can do as possible, it then frees up the remaining resource that you have to put more effort into those who don't have access to digital platforms. So that's certainly the approach that we've seen for some of our clients. And then we've also seen where we've tried to build in an approach, a more formalized approach for word of mouth. So campaigns, for example, running over social media, but rather than them just talking about the service directly to the people that are seeing those social media posts or ads or what have you, giving them information and a call to act to reach out to those people in their lives and their communities that they know may not engage with the social media content. So kind of almost trying to turn people who are on your social channels into your ambassadors, or as your kind of word of mouth champions, and doing and speaking to them directly about that. So providing information that can be passed on through word of mouth, making sure that you speak to people and recognise that they'll have people in their networks or communities that they can reach with this information. So it's not straightforward, as Chris says. There's low cost ways, of course, of reaching people without having to use digital, but in a weird roundabout way, try and use digital to reach those non-digitally enabled audiences as well. Try and find ways that you can access them, whether it's through people that they know or word of mouth or what have you. It can sometimes work that way.
Brilliant. And thanks to people adding some ideas, initiatives that they're running themselves, which I'm sure other people, if they've got the chat open, can benefit from seeing other people's ideas. Cambridgeshire offering a digital buddies, volunteers to assist with online access. A few people talking about hosting an event, and I think events are really, really powerful. Obviously, we're getting back into a situation now where people are going to events and feeling more comfortable about events, and libraries as event spaces is going to certainly come back, and I think that's a very powerful thing. And I think, you know, I've often thought sometimes simple is best. So I've had conversations with people running events and sort of say, you know, we always get the same people coming though. Our events aren't really reaching anybody new. And, you know, I've said, well, have you asked them to bring a friend? They go, well, no, but we want them to. I say, well, ask them to then. You know, sometimes it's the obvious stuff. Doesn't mean they're all going to do it. But if you say to people, look, we're trying to broaden the reach of our events, you know, for all those people who come to our events regularly, how about bringing a friend or a member of the family? And you'd be surprised, actually, people go, oh, yeah, I haven't thought of doing that. And so sometimes the thing that you want people to do is, it is as simple as just spelling it out for them and making it easy for them. All right, they might, again, like Faye said, there could be a little incentive that you could bring into that. But sometimes just asking the simple questions can end in a good solution. So sometimes obvious is best.
And that actually supercharges the sense of value that those existing service users feel. You kind of, I mentioned the word before, you sort of almost turning them into ambassadors for you. And if you actually recognize that and enable them to do that job for you, it can be really powerful because they can have a reach, they can bring more people to you, but you can also really strengthen the bond that you have with those key service users, and recognize that they could then be taken on the journey a little bit further. We've set up and run ambassador-based campaigns for charities and organisations in the past with tremendous success, and those people often are the absolute powerhouse of future campaigns that are run. So it's definitely worth looking at those people that are really committed service users for you at the moment, and that almost can sometimes be overlooked because you know they're always going to be there or they're always going to be committed, but how can you actually unlock the power that they have, value them more, and turn them into a marketing asset for you?
Brilliant. I think that's probably, unless there's any last questions, I think we'll probably wrap up now. And as I said, thank